The October wind cut through my jacket like a knife as I fumbled with the keys to my front door, my hands still stained with motor oil from another 14-hour day at the garage. At 48, I should have been smarter than to think hard work alone would keep a marriage together, but Danny Sullivan had never been accused of being the sharpest tool in the shed. The house felt wrong the moment I stepped inside. Too quiet, too clean. The kind of clean that screams guilt. "Sarah?" I called out, dropping my toolbox by the door with a metallic clang that echoed through our modest two-story home. No answer. Her car wasn't in the driveway, which wasn't unusual these days. My wife had been working late more often than a vampire, always some urgent project at the marketing firm where she'd climb the ladder faster than a cat escaping a dog. I was halfway to the kitchen, already planning my dinner of leftover pizza and beer, when I heard footsteps on the stairs. Heavy, deliberate steps that belonged to someone who'd been crying. "Dad?" My daughter Emma's voice cracked like she was 16 again instead of 21. She appeared at the bottom of the staircase, her usually perfect blonde hair disheveled, mascara streaked down her cheeks like war paint. "Jesus, Em, what happened? Did someone hurt you?" The protective father in me surged forward, ready to demolish whoever had made my little girl cry. She shook her head and held out something that made my blood freeze. A small digital recorder, the kind journalists use, with a piece of masking tape stuck to it. Written in Emma's careful handwriting were two words that would change everything: Mom's secret. "I found it in her car when I borrowed it last week," Emma whispered, her hands shaking as she pressed the device into my palm. "I wasn't snooping, I swear. It fell out from under the seat when I was looking for quarters for parking." The recorder felt heavier than it should have, like it contained the weight of 23 years of marriage. I stared at it, knowing that whatever was on there would either destroy my paranoid suspicions or confirm my worst nightmares. "Did you listen to it?" I asked, though her tear-stained face already gave me the answer. "I'm sorry, Dad. I'm so sorry." She collapsed into the old recliner that had been my throne for the past decade, the one Sarah always complained about, but I refused to throw away. "I should have just deleted it, but I thought you deserved to know." My finger hovered over the play button like it was the trigger of a loaded gun. 23 years of marriage, 2 kids, a mortgage, and a life built together. All of it balanced on the edge of whatever was recorded on this tiny device. "How long?" I asked. "The recording? About 10 minutes? No, how long have you known?" Emma's face crumpled. 3 weeks. I've been going crazy, Dad. I didn't know what to do. I kept hoping it was just, I don't know, research for a campaign or something stupid like that." I pressed play. The first voice I heard was my wife's, but not the Sarah who complained about dirty dishes and reminded me to take out the garbage. This was a different Sarah, breathless and eager, saying things to someone named Rick that she'd never said to me. Not in 23 years. The second voice belonged to a man I'd met exactly once, at Sarah's company Christmas party. Rick Morrison, her new account director, all flash and no substance, with his expensive suits and his BMW and his smile that never reached his eyes. I listened to 10 minutes of my marriage disintegrating in real time, recorded accidentally when Sarah's phone had apparently started a voice memo during one of their encounters. The technical details of how it happened didn't matter. What mattered was that my wife was having an affair, and she was enjoying it more than anything she'd ever done with me. When it ended, the house was silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator and Emma's quiet sobbing. "Dad, Pack a bag," I said, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. Inside, I felt like a nuclear reactor in meltdown, but outside, I was as steady as a rock. "Go stay with your brother for a few days. I'm not leaving you alone." "Yes, you are." I looked at my daughter, this beautiful young woman who'd just handed me the ammunition to destroy her mother, and felt something cold settle in my chest. Because what happens next isn't going to be pretty, and you don't need to see your old man turn into someone you won't recognize. Emma stood up, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "What are you going to do?" I pocketed the recorder and smiled, but it felt like broken glass in my mouth. "I'm going to remind your mother and her boyfriend that actions have consequences, and I'm going to enjoy every second of it." As Emma packed her bag, I sat in my recliner and planned the destruction of 2 people who'd thought they were smarter than Danny Sullivan, the grease monkey with calloused hands and a high school education. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The next morning, I called in sick for the first time in 3 years. Frank, my business partner at Sullivan & Associates Auto Repair, didn't ask questions. He'd known me long enough to recognize when something was seriously wrong. "Take all the time you need, Danny," he said over the phone. "I've got things covered here." Sarah had left early, as usual, with a quick kiss on the cheek and a mumbled excuse about a breakfast meeting. I'd smiled and wished her a good day, playing the role of the oblivious husband one last time. But Danny Sullivan was done being oblivious. I spent the morning doing research. Rick Morrison wasn't hard to find online. The guy had an ego the size of Texas and a social media presence to match. LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram. He was everywhere, showing off his expensive lifestyle like a peacock in a designer suit. 39 years old, divorced, no kids, lived in one of those new luxury condos downtown, the kind with a doorman and a gym and a pool on the roof. Drove a silver BMW M4 that probably cost more than I made in 2 years. His Facebook page was a masterclass in narcissism. Photos of him at expensive restaurants, on ski trips, at charity events where he posed with politicians and local celebrities. And there, in several recent photos, was my wife. Not tagged, not identified, but definitely there. Sarah at a wine tasting. Sarah at some fancy restaurant. Sarah laughing at something Rick had said, looking at him the way she used to look at me. The rage that had been simmering in my chest since last night started to boil over. I closed the laptop and went to the garage, where I kept my real tools. Not the ones for fixing cars, but the ones I'd inherited from my father, who'd been a different kind of mechanic back in the day. Lockpicks, Slim Jims, a few electronic devices that weren't exactly legal but weren't exactly illegal either, depending on how you use them. I hadn't touched them in years, but muscle memory is a funny thing. Within an hour, I was as sharp as I'd ever been. By noon, I was parked across the street from Rick Morrison's building, watching the valet parking attendants bring cars in and out of the underground garage. The BMW was easy to spot. Rick had personalized plates that read RK Star, subtle as a brick through a window. I waited until 2 p.m. when Rick posted a photo on Instagram of his lunch at some trendy bistro across town. Then I made my move. The valet was a college kid who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. I walked up to him with my most friendly smile and a $20 bill. "Hey, I'm supposed to meet Rick Morrison here, but my phone died," I lied smoothly. "Could you call up to his apartment and let him know Danny's here?" The kid pocketed the 20 and made the call. When there was no answer, he shrugged. "Sorry, man, he's not home." "No problem, I'll just wait in my car." I handed him another 20. "Maybe don't mention this to Rick when you see him. I want to surprise him." Money talks, and college kids listen. The valet nodded and went back to his post. I spent the next hour learning everything I could about Rick Morrison's routine. He came and went at predictable times. Always used the valet. Always tipped exactly 10%. Always checked his reflection in the lobby's mirrors before heading out. A creature of habit. That was good. Creatures of habit were easy to trap. At 4 p.m., I followed him to a coffee shop where he met with 2 other people from Sarah's company. I sat 3 tables away, close enough to hear them discussing a campaign for some local restaurant chain. Rick dominated the conversation, interrupting the others, taking credit for ideas that clearly weren't his. He was everything I'd expected, arrogant, shallow, and completely in love with himself. At 5:30, he drove back to his building. I waited another hour, then made my second move of the day. The parking garage was easier to access than it should have been. A few minutes with the right tools, and I was inside, standing next to the BMW that had probably seen more action with my wife than our bedroom had in the past year. I didn't damage it, not yet. That would come later, when the time was right. Instead, I planted a small GPS tracker under the rear bumper and attached a tiny recording device to the undercarriage near the exhaust pipe. Both were virtually invisible unless you knew where to look. Then I went home and waited for Sarah. She walked in at 7:45, full of apologies about traffic and late meetings. She kissed me on the cheek again, that same perfunctory peck that had replaced real affection years ago. "How was your day?" she asked, not really listening as she sorted through the mail. "Productive," I said. "Very productive." We ate dinner in relative silence, Sarah checking her phone every few minutes, probably texting with Rick, planning their next encounter. I made small talk about the garage, about Emma's classes, about anything except what I really wanted to say. After dinner, Sarah announced she had to finish some work upstairs. I nodded and settled into my recliner with a beer, playing the role of the simple, trusting husband. But upstairs, I could hear her on the phone, her voice taking on that same breathless quality I'd heard on the recording. She was talking to him, making plans, lying to me with every word. I pulled out my own phone, and opened the app connected to the GPS tracker. A little blue dot showed Rick's BMW was still parked at his building. For now. Tomorrow, the real game would begin. I finished my beer and smiled. Sarah and Rick thought they were playing chess while I was stuck playing checkers. They were about to discover that Danny Sullivan had been playing a completely different game all along, and I was very good at it. Wednesday morning arrived gray and cold, matching my mood perfectly. Sarah left at her usual time, claiming another early meeting. I watched from the bedroom window as she drove away in her Honda Civic, probably heading straight to Rick's condo for a quickie before work. The GPS tracker confirmed my suspicions. Instead of going to her office, Sarah's car was parked at Rick's building by 7:15 a.m. She stayed there for exactly 45 minutes before heading to work. Predictable, sloppy, amateur. I'd been married to this woman for 23 years, and I was just now realizing how little I actually knew her. The Sarah I'd fallen in love with had been careful, methodical, always thinking 3 steps ahead. This Sarah was drunk on excitement and making mistakes. That worked in my favor. I spent the morning preparing. First, I called my lawyer, Jim Patterson, who'd handled our wills and Emma's college paperwork. I scheduled an appointment for Friday, telling him I needed to discuss some personal matters. Jim had been around long enough to read between the lines. Next, I visited my bank. Not to do anything dramatic like emptying accounts. That would come later, and only if necessary. For now, I just wanted to understand exactly what Sarah and I owned together and what we owned separately. The news wasn't good. Sarah had been smart about money, smarter than I'd given her credit for. Most of our assets were joint, but she'd been steadily building her own nest egg, a savings account I didn't know about, a retirement fund that was entirely in her name, even a small investment portfolio. She'd been planning this for a while. The affair with Rick wasn't a spur-of-the-moment thing, it was an exit strategy. That stung more than I expected. It meant she'd been lying to me for months, maybe years, while I'd been completely oblivious. Working 14-hour days to keep the garage afloat, coming home exhausted, never noticing that my wife was already halfway out the door. But it also gave me ammunition. If Sarah wanted to play the long game, I could play it too. And I had advantages she didn't know about. By noon, I was back to following Rick Morrison. The GPS tracker made it easy. I could stay blocks away and still know exactly where he was. He went to lunch at the same trendy bistro as yesterday, this time alone, probably texting with Sarah, making plans for their next encounter. I parked across the street and watched him through the restaurant's windows. Even from a distance, I could see him checking his reflection in every reflective surface, adjusting his hair, straightening his tie. The man was more concerned with his appearance than a teenage girl getting ready for prom. Vanity. That was his weakness. Rick Morrison was the kind of man who would rather be caught cheating than caught looking bad. I could work with that. After lunch, Rick went back to the office. Sarah's marketing firm was housed in a converted warehouse downtown, all exposed brick and industrial lighting, trying too hard to look creative and cutting edge. I'd been there exactly twice in the 5 years Sarah had worked there, once for her hiring celebration, once for last year's Christmas party. Both times, I'd felt like a fish out of water. All those smooth-talking marketing types with their expensive clothes and their casual name-dropping, making it clear that a grease monkey like me didn't belong in their world. Sarah had been embarrassed by me. I could see it in the way she introduced me, the way she steered conversations away from my work, the way she'd found excuses to leave early both times. Now I understood why. She wasn't just embarrassed by what I did for a living. She was embarrassed by me, period. Danny Sullivan, with his calloused hands and his high school education, was holding back her image of herself as a sophisticated professional. Rick Morrison was her upgrade. Younger, flashier, more successful. The kind of man she thought she deserved. I sat in my truck across from her office building and watched people come and go. Young, ambitious types who probably thought they were changing the world by convincing people to buy things they didn't need. At 3:30, Sarah emerged with Rick and 2 other people. They stood on the sidewalk talking, and I got my first good look at them together in daylight. The way Sarah laughed at Rick's jokes, the way she touched his arm when she talked, the way she looked at him like he was the most interesting person in the world. She'd never looked at me like that, not even in the beginning. They separated after a few minutes, Rick heading to his BMW, Sarah going back inside. I followed Rick to a high-end men's clothing store where he spent an hour trying on suits that cost more than most people made in a month. Watching him preen in front of the mirrors, I realized something important. Rick Morrison was just as insecure as I was. All the flash, all the expensive toys, all the social media posturing, it was armor. He was trying just as hard to be someone he wasn't. The difference was that he was better at it. But insecurity was another weakness I could exploit. Insecure people made desperate choices when their image was threatened, and I was planning to threaten a lot more than Rick Morrison's image. I followed him home, watching as he handed his keys to the valet with that same casual arrogance. The kid probably made minimum wage, but Rick treated him like furniture. That night, Sarah came home at her usual time, full of her usual excuses. We went through our usual routine: dinner, small talk, her disappearing upstairs to work while I sat in my recliner. But this time I wasn't just sitting there feeling sorry for myself. I was planning. I pulled out a notebook and started making lists: Sarah's routines, Rick's habits, the people they worked with, their friends, their weaknesses. By the time I went to bed, I had the outline of a plan that would destroy both of them without breaking a single law. It would take patience, timing, and a willingness to become someone I'd never been before. Sarah was already asleep when I slipped into bed beside her. She didn't stir when I settled in, didn't reach for me the way she used to in the early years. I lay there in the dark, listening to her breathe, and felt the last of my love for her turn into something colder and more useful. Tomorrow I would start tearing down the life she'd built on lies, and I was going to enjoy every minute of it. Thursday morning, I made my first real move. Instead of following Sarah or Rick, I went to see someone who knew more about their workplace dynamics than anyone: Janet Walsh, Sarah's former assistant who'd been laid off 6 months ago. I found Janet at the coffee shop where she'd been working since losing her marketing job. She looked surprised to see me, but not unhappy. We'd always gotten along well during the company events I'd attended. "Danny, what brings you here?" She wiped down the counter with a tired smile. "Don't tell me Sarah's got you running errands for the office now." "Something like that," I said, ordering a black coffee and leaving a generous tip. "Actually, I was hoping we could talk. Maybe when you get off work." Janet's expression shifted slightly. She'd always been sharp, and I could see her picking up on the tension in my voice. "Is everything okay?" "That depends on your definition of okay." I met her eyes. "Let's just say I'm learning some interesting things about my wife's work life." We agreed to meet at a bar called Murphy's after her shift ended at 4 p.m. Murphy's was the kind of place where people went to drink away their problems, not to be seen. Perfect for the conversation I had in mind. I spent the rest of the day preparing. I made copies of the recording Emma had given me, storing them in multiple locations. I researched Janet's employment history, her financial situation, her reasons for leaving Sarah's company. What I found was interesting. Janet hadn't been laid off due to budget cuts, as Sarah had told me. She'd been fired for insubordination after questioning some of Rick Morrison's expense reports. Apparently, Rick had been billing personal expenses to client accounts, and Janet had been foolish enough to bring it to HR's attention. Instead of investigating Rick, the company had gotten rid of Janet. Rick was bringing in too much business to risk losing him over some accounting irregularities. That gave me leverage. I arrived at Murphy's early and claimed a corner booth where we could talk privately. Janet showed up exactly on time, still wearing her coffee shop uniform, looking like she'd rather be anywhere else. "So," she said, sliding into the booth across from me, "what's this about?" I pulled out my phone and placed it on the table between us. "Before I play this, I need to know something. When you worked for Sarah, did you ever suspect she was having an affair?" Janet's face went pale. "Danny, I don't think—" "Just answer the question." She was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands. Finally, she nodded. "I suspected. The way she started dressing differently, staying late, taking personal calls. And Rick? Rick was always finding excuses to be in her office. But you never said anything. It wasn't my place, and honestly, I needed that job." She looked up at me with genuine regret. "I'm sorry, Danny. I should have—" "You should have what? Warned the husband that his wife was cheating? That's not your responsibility." I pressed play on the recording. Janet's face went through a series of expressions as she listened: shock, disgust, anger, and finally a cold satisfaction that surprised me. When it ended, she was quiet for a full minute. "How long?" she asked. "I don't know. A few months at least, maybe longer." "And you want my help getting back at them?" "I want information about Rick's business practices, about the company culture, about who knows what and who might be willing to talk." Janet signaled the waitress for another drink. "What makes you think I know anything useful?" "Because you were fired for asking questions about Rick's expense reports. Because you've got nothing to lose and every reason to want to see him brought down, and because you're smart enough to have kept records." She smiled for the first time since sitting down. "You're not as simple as Sarah always made you out to be, are you?" That stung, but I kept my expression neutral. "What did she say about me?" "Nothing terrible, just she made it clear that you two were growing apart, that you didn't understand her ambitions, that you were happy with your little garage while she wanted bigger things. Bigger things like Rick Morrison." "Rick's not the first, Danny." Janet's voice was quiet but firm. "There was someone before him, a client named David Chen. That lasted about 3 months before his wife found out and threatened to pull their account." The hits kept coming. I absorbed this new information without showing how much it hurt. "Anyone else?" "Not that I know of for certain, but Sarah's been different for the past 2 years. More secretive, more image-conscious. She started talking about needing to rebrand herself. Rebrand herself right out of her marriage, apparently." We spent the next hour going over everything Janet knew about Rick's business practices, Sarah's recent behavior, and the office politics at the marketing firm. By the time we parted ways, I had enough information to cause serious problems for both of them. But information was just the first step. I needed a way to use it that would cause maximum damage while keeping my hands clean. That night, Sarah came home with a story about working late on a big presentation. She seemed more animated than usual, probably still glowing from whatever she and Rick had been doing in his office after hours. "You seem happy," I observed, not looking up from the newspaper I was pretending to read. "It's been a good day. We landed the Morrison account, that big restaurant chain I was telling you about." Morrison account. Rick's own company name. The arrogance was breathtaking. "That's great, honey. I'm proud of you." She actually blushed. "Thanks, Danny. I know I've been distracted lately, but this could really take my career to the next level." "I'm sure it will." We went through our usual evening routine, but I could barely contain my excitement. Not the good kind of excitement. The dark, anticipatory thrill of knowing that everything Sarah thought she'd built was about to come crashing down. I waited until she was asleep, then went to my computer and started drafting an anonymous email to the marketing firm's biggest client, a conservative family business that prided itself on traditional values. The email included details about Rick's expense account irregularities, his pattern of workplace affairs, and his general unprofessional behavior. I didn't mention Sarah specifically, not yet. This was just the opening move. I scheduled the email to be sent Friday morning, then went to bed and slept better than I had in weeks. Phase 1 was complete. Tomorrow, Rick Morrison's carefully constructed world would start falling apart. And this was just the beginning. Friday morning brought the first real satisfaction I'd felt in weeks. I was at the garage by 6 a.m., ostensibly to catch up on work I'd missed, but really to monitor the fallout from my anonymous email. The marketing firm's biggest client, Harrison Family Restaurants, was run by old-school conservatives who took their public image seriously. If my research was correct, they wouldn't tolerate even a whiff of scandal associated with their brand. I didn't have to wait long. At 9:30 a.m., Janet texted me, "Holy crap! Rick just got called into an emergency meeting with the partners. He looked like he was going to throw up." By 10 a.m., Sarah was calling me, her voice tight with stress. "Danny, I can't talk long, but there's some kind of crisis at work. Someone sent allegations about Rick to the Harrison account, and they're threatening to pull their business." "That's terrible," I said, injecting just the right amount of concern into my voice. "What kind of allegations?" "Financial impropriety, unprofessional conduct. It's all lies, but the Harrisons don't care. They want Rick removed from their account immediately." "Can the company afford to lose that account?" "No, it's 30% of our revenue." Sarah's voice cracked slightly. "Danny, I might lose my job over this. If they decide to clean house, I'm sure it'll work out, honey. You're good at what you do." But I knew it wouldn't work out. Not the way Sarah hoped. Because the Harrison account was just the beginning. Over the next few hours, I received updates from Janet, who was getting information from friends still at the company. Rick had been suspended pending a full investigation. The partners were in damage control mode, trying to save the Harrison account. Sarah was being questioned about her working relationship with Rick. By afternoon, local business reporters had picked up the story. Rick Morrison, the golden boy of the marketing world, was suddenly toxic. His social media accounts went dark. His BMW disappeared from the company parking garage. I felt a cold satisfaction watching it all unfold. But I wasn't done. Not even close. That evening, Sarah came home looking like she'd aged 5 years in one day. Her usually perfect hair was disheveled, her makeup smeared. She collapsed into the couch and stared at the ceiling. "They fired him," she said without preamble. "Rick's gone, and they're reviewing everyone who worked closely with him." "I'm sorry, Sarah, that must be difficult." She looked at me with something like surprise. "You're being very understanding about this." "Why wouldn't I be? It's not your fault your coworker turned out to be corrupt. If only she knew how corrupt." "The thing is," Sarah continued, "I don't think Rick did what they're accusing him of. Someone's targeting him, trying to destroy his reputation." "Who would do that?" "I don't know. A competitor, maybe. Or someone with a personal grudge." I nodded sympathetically while thinking about the next phase of my plan. Rick's professional destruction was satisfying, but it wasn't enough. I wanted him to understand what it felt like to have your life torn apart by someone you'd underestimated. That weekend, while Sarah spent her time frantically networking and updating her resume, I paid a visit to Rick's luxury condo building. Not to confront him, that would come later. I just wanted to see how he was handling his fall from grace. I didn't have to wait long. Rick emerged from the building at noon, looking nothing like the polished professional I'd been watching all week. His usually perfect hair was unkempt, his expensive clothes wrinkled. He walked to the parking garage like a man heading to his own execution. The BMW was gone, probably repossessed. In its place was a beat-up Honda Civic that had seen better days. Rick stood staring at it for a full minute, as if he couldn't believe this was his life now. I almost felt sorry for him, almost. But then I remembered the recording, the sound of my wife's voice saying things to this man that she'd never said to me, and the sympathy evaporated. Rick drove to a strip mall bar, the kind of place he would have sneered at a week ago. I followed at a distance and watched through the window as he ordered drink after drink, staring at his phone like he was waiting for someone to call and tell him this was all a mistake. No one called. I went home and found Sarah on her laptop, furiously sending out resumes and LinkedIn messages. She looked up when I walked in, her eyes red from crying. "I think I'm going to be fired on Monday," she said. "They can't afford to keep anyone associated with Rick." "Then we'll figure it out," I said. "We've been through tough times before." She stared at me like I was speaking a foreign language. "Danny, you don't understand. This isn't just about money. My reputation is ruined. No one in this industry will hire me after this. Maybe it's time to try a different industry. I'm 45 years old. I can't start over now." But she could start over. People did it all the time. The difference was that Sarah had never had to face real consequences for her choices. She'd sailed through life on her looks and her charm, always landing on her feet. Not this time. That night, as Sarah tossed and turned beside me, I lay awake planning my next move. Rick's career was destroyed, but he still had his freedom, his health, his ability to start over somewhere else. I wasn't done with him yet. Not by a long shot. And I wasn't done with Sarah either. She still thought she was the victim in all this, that she'd been caught up in someone else's scandal through no fault of her own. It was time to show her how wrong she was. Monday morning arrived with the inevitability of a funeral. Sarah left for work early, probably hoping to get to the office before the axe fell. I gave her a supportive kiss goodbye and wished her luck, playing the role of the devoted husband one last time. Then I got in my truck and drove to Rick Morrison's condo. The valet was different from the one I'd bribed last week, probably a new hire, since the building seemed to be cutting costs. I parked on the street and waited. Rick emerged at 10 a.m., looking even worse than he had over the weekend. 3 days of unemployment had taken their toll. His face was unshaven, his clothes looked like he'd slept in them, and he moved like a man carrying the weight of the world. He got into the beat-up Honda and drove to a coffee shop in a part of town he'd probably never visited when he was driving the BMW. I followed him inside and ordered a coffee, sitting 2 tables away where I could watch and listen. Rick was on his phone making call after call, job inquiries probably, or attempts to salvage his reputation. Each conversation followed the same pattern: initial politeness from the other party, followed by awkward silence when Rick identified himself, followed by quick excuses to end the call. His name was poison in the local business community. Word traveled fast in a town this size, and Rick Morrison was now synonymous with scandal and unprofessional conduct. After an hour of rejections, Rick put his phone down and stared into his coffee cup like it might contain answers. That's when I made my move. "Rough week?" I asked, sliding into the chair across from him. Rick looked up, confused. It took him a moment to recognize me. We'd only met once, briefly, at that Christmas party. But when recognition dawned, his face went pale. "Danny Sullivan," he said slowly. "Sarah's husband." "That's right. Though I'm starting to wonder if Sarah still thinks of herself as my wife." Rick's eyes darted around the coffee shop, looking for escape routes. "Look, I don't know what you think. I think you've been sleeping with my wife for the past few months. I think you've been meeting her at your condo, taking her on romantic trips, and generally treating my marriage like it doesn't exist. You're mistaken. Sarah and I work together, that's all." I pulled out my phone and placed it on the table between us. "Would you like me to play the recording that proves you're lying? It's quite explicit. I'm sure the other customers would find it educational." Rick's face went from pale to gray. How I got it doesn't matter. What matters is that I have it, and I'm the one who sent those allegations to Harrison Restaurants." The coffee cup slipped from Rick's hand, spilling across the table. "You destroyed my career. You destroyed my marriage. I just returned the favor." Rick grabbed napkins and started mopping up the spilled coffee, his hands shaking. "What do you want? Money? I don't have much left, but I don't want your money, Rick. I want you to understand something. You thought you were so much better than me. The successful businessman stealing the garage owner's wife, the sophisticated guy upgrading her from her blue-collar husband. It wasn't like that. It was exactly like that. You saw Sarah as a trophy, and you saw me as someone too stupid to notice or too weak to do anything about it." Rick looked around the coffee shop again, probably hoping someone would intervene. But this wasn't the kind of neighborhood where people got involved in other people's business. "You were wrong on both counts," I continued. "I noticed everything, and I'm a lot stronger than you thought. Look, I'm sorry about Sarah. I know it's wrong, but we didn't plan for it to happen. It just... Don't." My voice was quiet but firm. "Don't insult my intelligence by pretending this was some romantic love story. You wanted to screw my wife, and she wanted to screw someone she thought was better than me. It's that simple." Rick was quiet for a long moment, staring at the mess on the table. When he looked up, there was something different in his eyes. Not fear exactly, but a kind of desperate calculation. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now you disappear. You leave town, you start over somewhere else, and you never contact my wife again." "And if I don't?" I smiled, and Rick flinched. "Then I send copies of that recording to everyone in your contact list. Your family, your friends, your professional network. I post it on social media with your name attached. I make sure that wherever you go, whatever you try to do, people know exactly who Rick Morrison really is. You can't do that. It's illegal. Actually, it's not. The recording was made accidentally, which makes it admissible. And since Sarah is my wife, I have legal standing to use it. I checked with a lawyer. That was a lie, but Rick didn't know that. Besides," I continued, "even if it were illegal, what are you going to do? Call the police? Explain to them how you ended up being recorded having an affair with a married woman?" Rick slumped in his chair, defeated. "I'll go. I'll leave town and never contact Sarah again. Smart choice." I stood up to leave, then turned back. "Oh, and Rick? If you're thinking about warning Sarah, about telling her what really happened to your career, don't. She's going to have enough problems of her own very soon." I left him sitting there in the coffee shop, staring at the spilled coffee and the wreckage of his life. It should have felt better than it did, but revenge was turning out to be more complicated than I'd expected. The satisfaction was there, but it was cold and hollow. I'd destroyed a man's career and driven him out of town, and all I felt was empty. But I wasn't done yet. Rick had been the easy target, the outsider who'd invaded my marriage. Sarah was the real betrayer, the one who'd broken vows and promises and 23 years of trust. Her reckoning was still coming, and unlike Rick, she wouldn't have the option of running away. Sarah came home that Monday evening looking like she'd been hit by a truck. As I'd predicted, she'd been fired. Budget cuts, they'd called it, but we both knew the real reason. "I'm so sorry, honey," I said, pulling her into what felt like the last genuine hug I'd ever give her. "This is all so unfair," she cried against my shoulder, and for a moment, I almost felt guilty about what I'd done. Almost. "Danny, I need to tell you something," she said, pulling back to look at me. "About Rick and me." Here it was, the confession I'd been waiting for. We got close while working together. Too close. I think that's part of why they let me go." "How close?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "We had an affair." The words came out in a rush, like she'd been holding her breath for months. It started 3 months ago, and I know it was wrong, but I felt so alive with him, so appreciated. I sat down heavily in my recliner, playing the part of the devastated husband. How could you do this to us, Sarah? To our family? I don't know. I was stupid and selfish, and I'm so sorry. She knelt beside my chair, tears streaming down her face. But it's over now. Rick's gone, and I want to make this work. I want to save our marriage. It was a good performance. She almost sounded sincere. Where is Rick now? I asked. I don't know. He's not answering his phone. I think he left town after everything that happened with his job. Maybe that's for the best. Sarah nodded eagerly. Yes, it is. It gives us a chance to start over, to rebuild what we had. What we had. As if 23 years of marriage could be repaired with an apology and a promise to do better. I need some time to process this, I said. This is a lot to take in. Of course, take all the time you need. I'll do whatever it takes to earn your trust back. That night, we slept in the same bed for the last time, though Sarah was the only one who knew it. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to her breathe, thinking about everything that had led to this moment. Tomorrow, I would show her that some betrayals couldn't be forgiven, and some bridges couldn't be rebuilt once they'd been burned. The next morning, Sarah left early for a job interview. I waited until she was gone, then made a series of phone calls. First, to my lawyer, confirming our Friday appointment and asking him to prepare divorce papers. Second, to my bank, arranging to transfer half of our joint assets to a separate account in my name only. Third, to a real estate agent, asking for a market evaluation of our house. Fourth, to Emma, asking her to come home that evening for a family meeting. And finally, to Frank at the garage, telling him I'd be taking the rest of the week off for personal reasons. Everything okay, Danny? He asked. It will be, I said. After tonight, everything will be perfectly clear. I spent the day preparing. I made copies of all our important documents, gathered evidence of Sarah's affair, and wrote a letter explaining my decisions. I also made a few calls to Sarah's remaining friends and colleagues, planting seeds of doubt about her character and reliability. By evening, I was ready. Sarah came home at 6 p.m., excited about her job interview. I think it went really well, she said, kissing me on the cheek. The position doesn't pay as much as my old job, but it's a start. That's great, honey. Emma arrived an hour later looking nervous. She'd been staying with her brother since I'd asked her to leave, and she seemed unsure about being back in the house. What's this about, Dad? She asked. Family meeting? I said. We need to clear the air about some things. We gathered in the living room, Sarah and Emma on the couch, me in my recliner. For a moment, it looked like any normal family gathering. Sarah, I began, I want you to know that I appreciate you telling me about the affair. It took courage to admit what you'd done. She smiled hopefully. I'm glad I finally told you the truth. The thing is, I already knew about it. I've known for over a week. The smile faded. What do you mean? I looked at Emma, who was staring at her hands. Emma found a recording in your car, 10 minutes of you and Rick Morrison having sex in his condo. Sarah's face went white. Emma, how could you? Don't blame her, I interrupted. She did what any good daughter would do. She told her father that his wife was cheating on him. Danny, please, let me explain. There's nothing to explain. I've heard the recording. I've seen the evidence. I know about your secret savings account, your investment portfolio, your exit strategy. Sarah looked like she was going to be sick. You went through my financial records? I went through everything, your emails, your phone records, your credit card statements. Did you really think I was too stupid to figure out what you were doing? It wasn't supposed to happen like this. How was it supposed to happen, Sarah? Were you planning to divorce me after you'd secured your new life with Rick? Or were you just going to keep lying until I died of old age? Emma was crying now, but I couldn't stop. 23 years of marriage, of trust, of building a life together, and it had all been a lie. I know about David Chen, too, I said. Your affair before Rick. Janet Walsh told me all about it. Sarah's face crumpled. You talked to Janet? I talked to a lot of people. Amazing how many of your colleagues suspected what you were doing. Amazing how little respect they had for you because of it. Danny, please. I filed for divorce this afternoon. I've frozen our joint accounts and had you removed from the house insurance. You have 30 days to find somewhere else to live. You can't do this. I can, and I have. The papers will be served tomorrow morning. Sarah stood up, her face flushed with anger. You think you're so smart, don't you? You think you've won some kind of game? I think I've protected myself from someone who was planning to destroy my life. Your life was already destroyed. You're a 48-year-old mechanic with no ambition, no vision, no future. I settled for you, Danny, and I've regretted it every day for the past 5 years. There it was. The truth, finally. Not the careful confession she'd planned, but the raw, ugly reality of how she really felt about me. Well, I said, standing up to face her, now you don't have to settle anymore. You're free to find someone who meets your high standards. Where am I supposed to go? You've destroyed my career, my reputation. I didn't destroy anything. I just revealed what was already there. Sarah looked around the room wildly, as if searching for allies. But Emma was still crying, and there was no one else to take her side. This isn't over, Sarah said. I'll fight you on everything. The house, the money, custody of Emma. Emma's 21. There's no custody to fight over, and good luck explaining to a judge why you deserve half of everything when you were planning to leave anyway. Sarah grabbed her purse and headed for the door. I'm going to a hotel. We'll see what my lawyer has to say about all this. Give my regards to Rick, I called after her. Oh, wait, you can't. He left town yesterday after I had a little chat with him. She stopped in the doorway, her hand on the knob. You talked to Rick? I told him to disappear and he did. Turns out he's not as tough as he pretended to be. Sarah stared at me like she was seeing me for the first time. You're not the man I married. No, I agreed. I'm not. The man you married was a fool who trusted his wife. This man knows better. She left without another word, slamming the door behind her. Emma and I sat in silence for a long time after she was gone. Finally, my daughter looked up at me with red, swollen eyes. Are you okay, Dad? I thought about the question. Was I okay? My marriage was over, my family was broken, and I'd become someone I didn't entirely recognize. But for the first time in months, I wasn't carrying the weight of lies and betrayal. I will be, I said. We both will be. 6 months later, the divorce was final. Sarah had fought me on everything, just as she'd promised. But the evidence was overwhelming. The recording, the financial records, the testimony from her former colleagues. It all painted a picture of a woman who'd been planning to abandon her marriage long before I'd discovered her affair. She got a job in another city, starting over at a much lower salary than she'd been making before. Rick Morrison had disappeared completely. Some people said he'd moved to California. Others thought he'd gone back east. I didn't care as long as he stayed gone. Emma finished college and got a job in town, close enough to visit regularly, but far enough away to have her own life. We were closer now than we'd been in years, bonded by the shared experience of surviving Sarah's betrayal. I kept the house, the garage, and most of our savings. More importantly, I kept my self-respect. People in town still talked about what had happened. The marketing executive who'd thrown away her marriage for a younger man, the mechanic who'd outsmarted them both. Some people thought I'd been too harsh. Others said Sarah had gotten what she deserved. I didn't much care what people thought. I'd learned that the only person whose opinion really mattered was the one looking back at me from the mirror, and that person could sleep peacefully at night knowing he'd fought for what was his and won. Sarah had been right about one thing. I wasn't the man she'd married. I was stronger, smarter, and a lot less trusting. I was someone who wouldn't be taken advantage of again. I was someone who'd learned that sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to be a victim. And as I sat in my recliner that evening, drinking a beer and watching the sunset through my living room window, I realized something important. For the first time in years, I was genuinely happy.